Maybe Donald Trump isn't as stupid as I thought. I'd hate to admit that publicly, but it does seem like he has put one over on the liberal corporate media this time. Scanning the recent Trump-related news, I couldn't help but notice a significant decline in the number of references to Weimar, Germany, Adolf Hitler, and the brink of fascism that America has supposedly been teetering on since Hillary Clinton lost the election. I Googled around pretty well, I think, but I couldn't find a single editorial warning that Trump is about to summarily cancel the U.S. Constitution, dissolve Congress, and proclaim himself Führer. Nor did I see any mention of Auschwitz or any other Nazi stuff. Which is weird, considering that the Hitler hysteria has been a standard feature of the official narrative we've been subjected to for the last 2 years. So how did Trump finally get the liberal corporate media to stop calling him a fascist? He did that by acting like a fascist, i.e., like a normal president. Which is to say, he did the bidding of the deep state goons and corporate mandarins that managed the global capitalist empire. The smiley, happy, democracy-spreading, post-fascist version of fascism we live under. I'm referring, of course, to Venezuela, which is one of the handful of uncooperative countries that are not playing ball with global capitalism and which haven't been regime changed yet. Trump greenlit the attempted coup purportedly being staged by the Venezuelan opposition, in quotes, but which is obviously a U.S. operation, or rather a global capitalist operation. As soon as he did, the corporate media immediately suspended calling him a fascist and comparing him to Adolf Hitler and so on, and started spewing out blatant propaganda supporting his effort to overthrow the elected government of a sovereign country. Overthrowing the governments of sovereign countries, destroying their economies, stealing their gold, and otherwise bringing them into the fold of global capitalist, quote, international community, is not exactly what most folks thought Trump meant by "Make America Great Again." Many Americans have never been to Venezuela or Syria or anywhere else the global capitalist empire has been ruthlessly restructuring since shortly after the end of the Cold War. They've not been lying awake at night worrying about Venezuelan democracy or Syrian democracy or Ukrainian democracy. This is not because Americans are a heartless people or an ignorant or a selfish people. It's because they are Americans, or rather because they believe they are Americans, and thus are more interested in the problems of Americans than the problems of people in faraway lands that have nothing whatsoever to do with America. Notwithstanding what the corporate media will tell you, Americans elected Donald Trump, a preposterous, self-aggrandizing clown, not because they were latent Nazis or because they were brainwashed by Russian hackers, but primarily because they wanted to believe that he sincerely cared about America and was going to try to make it great again, whatever that was supposed to mean exactly. Unfortunately, there is no America. There's nothing to make great again. America is a fiction, a fantasy, a nostalgia that hucksters like Donald Trump and other marginally less buffoonish hucksters use to sell whatever they're selling. Themselves, wars, cars, whatever. What there is in reality instead of America is a supranational global capitalist empire, a decentralized, interdependent network of global corporations, financial institutions, national governments, intelligence agencies, supranational government entities, military forces, media, and so on. If that sounds far-fetched or conspiratorial, look at what is going on in Venezuela. The entire global capitalist empire is working in concert to force the elected president of the country out of office. The US, the UK, Canada, France, Germany, Spain, Austria, Denmark, Poland, the Netherlands, Israel, Brazil, Peru, Chile, and Argentina have officially recognized Juan Guaido as the legitimate president of Venezuela, in spite of the fact that no one elected him. Only the empire's official enemies, that is, Russia, China, Iran, Syria, Cuba, and other uncooperative countries, are objecting to this, quote, democratic, close quote, coup. The global financial system, that is, banks, have frozen, i.e. stolen, Venezuela's assets and is attempting to transfer them to Guaido so that he can buy the Venezuelan military. The corporate media are hammering out the official narrative like a Gulbenkian piano, reference to Hitler's propaganda minister Goebbels, in an effort to convince the general public that all this has something to do with democracy. You would have to be a total moron or hopelessly brainwashed not to recognize what is happening. What is happening has nothing to do with America, the America that Americans believe they live in and that many of them want to make great again. What is happening is exactly what has been happening around the world since the end of the Cold War, albeit most dramatically in the Middle East. The de facto global capitalist empire is restructuring the planet with virtual impunity. It is methodically eliminating any and all impediments to the hegemony of global capitalism and the privatization and commodification of everything. Venezuela is one of those impediments. Overthrowing its government has nothing to do with America or the lives of actual Americans. America, in quotes, is not going to conquer Venezuela and plant an American flag on its soil. America, in quotes, is not going to steal its oil, ship it home, and parcel it out to Americans, in quotes, in their pickups in the parking lot of Walmart. What about those American oil corporations? They want Venezuelan oil, don't they? Well, sure they do. But here's the thing. There are no American oil corporations. Corporations, especially multi-billion-dollar transnational corporations, e.g. Chevron, ExxonMobil, etc., have no nationalities nor any real allegiances other than to their major shareholders. Chevron, for example, whose major shareholders are asset management and mutual fund companies like BlackRock, the Vanguard Group, SSGA Funds Management, Gold Capital Management, Wellington Management, and other transnational multi-trillion-dollar outfits. Do you really believe that being nominally headquartered in Boston or New York makes these companies American, or that Deutsche Bank is a German bank, or that BP is a British company? And Venezuela is just the most recent blatant example of the empire in action. Ask yourself honestly, what have the American regime change ops throughout the greater Middle East done for any actual Americans, other than to get a lot of them killed? Oh, and how about those bailouts for all those transnational American investment banks, or the billions America provides to Israel? Someone please explain how enriching the shareholders of transnational corporations like Raytheon, Boeing, and Lockheed Martin by selling billions in weapons to Saudi Arabia Islamists is benefiting the American people. How much of that Saudi money are you seeing? And wait, I've got another one for you. Call up your friendly 401k manager, ask how your Pfizer shares are doing, and then compare that to what you're paying some American insurance company to not really cover you. For the last 200 years or so, we've been conditioned to think of ourselves as the citizens of a collection of sovereign nation states, as Americans, Germans, Greeks, and so on. There are no more sovereign nation states. Global capitalism has done away with them, which is why we're experiencing a neo-nationalist backlash. Trump, Brexit, the so-called new populism, these are the death throes of national sovereignty, like the thrashing of a suffocating fish before you whack it and drop it in the cooler. The battle is over, but the fish doesn't know that. It didn't even realize there was a battle until it suddenly got jerked up out of the water. In any event, here we are at the advent of the global capitalist empire. We're not going back to the 19th century, nor even to the early 20th century. Neither Donald Trump nor anyone else is going to make America great again. Global capitalism will continue to remake the world into one gigantic marketplace where we work ourselves to death at nonsense jobs in order to buy things we don't need, accumulating debts we can never pay back, the interest on which will further enrich the global capitalist ruling classes, whom, as you may have noticed, are preparing for the future by purchasing luxury underground bunkers and post-apocalyptic compounds in New Zealand. That and militarizing the police, who they will need to maintain public order. You know, like they're doing in France at the moment, by beating, blinding, and hideously maiming those gilets jaunes, the yellow vest, protesters that the corporate media are doing their best to demonize or to render invisible. Or who knows, Americans and other Western consumers might take a page from those yellow vests, set aside their political differences, or at least ignore their hatred of each other long enough to actually try to achieve something, and focus their anger at the politicians and corporations that actually run the empire, as opposed to, you know, illegal immigrants and imaginary legions of Nazis and Russians. In the immortal words of General Buck Turgidson, I'm not saying we won't get our hair mussed, but heck, it might be worth a try, especially since the way things are going. We're probably going to end up out there anyway. That's a piece by C.J. Hopkins, an award-winning American playwright, novelist, and political satirist based in Berlin. I will post it on the Facebook page for Aware on the Air if you want to consult it again. The subject is fascism. Let's say a word about real fascism. This is from Bloomberg Opinion, a financial sheet that publishes occasionally good things. It's often been said, if you want to know what's really going on, don't read the political news in the New York Times and the Washington Post, read the financial pages. And Bloomberg is nothing but a financial page. Here's an opinion piece by Shashi Tharoor, an Indian member of parliament, the author of a number of books, including Inglorious Empire, What the British Did to India. He says the recent flap in Britain over Winston Churchill, with Labour politician John MacDonnell calling Britain's most revered Prime Minister a villain and prompting a rebuke from the latter's grandson, will astonish many people around the world. That's not because the label itself is a misnomer, but because MacDonnell was exercised by the death of one Welsh miner in 1910. In fact, Churchill has the blood of millions on his hands, whom the British prefer to forget. History, Churchill himself said, will judge me kindly because I intend to write it myself. He did, penning a multi-volume history of World War II, and won the Nobel Prize for Literature for his self-serving fictions. As the Australian Prime Minister Robert Menzies remarked of the man many Britons credit with winning the war, the Second World War, quote, his real tyrant is the glittering phrase, so attractive to his mind that awkward facts have to give way, close quote. Awkward facts, alas, there are plenty. As MacDonnell correctly noted, Churchill, as Home Secretary in 1910, sent battalions of police from London and ordered them to attack striking miners in Wales. One was killed and nearly 600 strikers and policemen were injured. It's unlikely this troubled his conscience much. He later assumed operational command of the police during a siege of armed Latvian anarchists in Stepney, where he decided to allow them to be burnt to death in a house where they were trapped. Shortly afterward, during the fight for Irish independence between 1918 and 1923, Churchill was one of the few British officials in favor of bombing Irish protesters from the air, suggesting using, quote, machine gun fire bombs, his phrase, to scatter them. As Secretary of State for the Colonies, he followed through on that threat in Iraq. He ordered a large-scale bombing of Mesopotamia in 1921, with an entire village wiped out in 45 minutes. George Bush didn't start this. When some British officials objected to his proposal for the use of gas against natives, as he said, he found their objections unreasonable. In fact, he argued that poison gas was more humane than outright extermination. Quote, the moral effect should be so good that the loss of life should be reduced to a minimum, close quote, from gas attacks in Iraq. This underscores the fundamental contrast in views of Churchill. In Britain and much of the West, he's seen as the savior of democracy, freedom, and all that is good in Western civilization, as one enthusiastic commentator put it. In fact, his record is far more mixed even there. Through the 1920s and early 30s, Churchill was an open admirer of Mussolini, declaring that the Italian fascist movement had rendered a service to the whole world. Traveling to Rome in 1927 to express his admiration for the fascist Duce, Churchill announced that, quote, he could not help being charmed, like so many other people have been, by Signor Mussolini's gentle and simple bearing, and by his calm, detached poise in many of so many burdens and dangers, close quote. That surprises you. You might remember that Franklin Roosevelt, who was president of the United States, a little later referred to that admirable Italian gentleman, Signor Mussolini. What Churchill was above all, though, was a committed imperialist, one determined to preserve the British Empire not just by defeating the Nazis, but much else besides. At the start of his career as a young cavalry officer on the northwest frontier of India, he declared the Pashtuns needed to recognize, quote, the superiority of the British race, and that those who resisted would be, quote, killed without quarter, close quote. He wrote happily about he and his comrades, quote, systematically, village by village, destroyed the houses, filled up the wells, blew down the towers, cut down the great shady trees, burned the crops, and broke the reservoirs in punitive devastation. Every tribesman caught was speared or cut down at once, close quote. In Kenya, Churchill either directed or was complicit in policy involving the forced relocation of local people from the fertile highlands to make way for white colonial settlers and the incarceration of over 150,000 men, women, and children in concentration camps. British authorities used rape, castration, lit cigarettes on tender spots, and electric shocks to torture Kenyans under Churchill's rule. And his principal victims were the Indians, quote, a beastly people with a beastly religion, as he charmingly called them, a foul race. Churchill was an appalling racist, one who could not bring himself to see any people of color as entitled to the same rights as himself. He did not admit, for instance, quote, that a great wrong has been done to the Red Indians of America or the black people of Australia by the fact that a stronger race, a higher grade race, has come in and taken its place, close quote. He fantasized luridly of having Mahatma Gandhi tied to the ground and trampled upon by elephants. Thanks to Churchill's personal decisions, more than 3 million Bengalis died of hunger in a 1943 famine. Churchill deliberately ordered the diversion of food from starving Indian civilians to well-supplied British soldiers, and even to top up European stockpiles meant for yet-to-be-liberated Greeks and Yugoslavs. Quote, the starvation of anyway underfed Bengalis is less serious than that of sturdy Greeks, he argued. When reminded of the suffering of Bengalis, his response was typically Churchillian. The famine was the Indians' own fault, he said, for breeding like rabbits. If the suffering was so dire, he wrote on the file, why hasn't Gandhi died yet? It's important to remember that these weren't enemies in a war. Churchill also wanted to drench the cities of the Ruhr, the German industrial region, in poison gas, and said to the Japanese, quote, we shall wipe them out, every one of them, men, women, and children. But here he was talking about British subjects. Nor can his views be excused as being reflective of their times. His own Secretary of State for War, Leo Amery, confessed that he could see very little difference between Churchill's attitude and Hitler's. Britons may yet thrill to Churchill's stirring words about freedom. But to the descendants of the Iraqis whom Churchill gassed, and the Greek protesters on the streets of Athens who were mowed down on his orders in 1944, killing 28 and maiming 120, to Senri Pashtuns and Irish, to Afghans and Kenyans and Welsh miners, as well as to Indians, it will always be a mystery why a few bombastic speeches have been enough to wash the bloodstains off Churchill's hands. We shall remember him as a war criminal and as an enemy of decency and humanity, a blinkered imperialist, untroubled by the oppression of non-white peoples, a man who fought not to defend, but to deny their freedom. On Churchill's actual role in World War II, which Americans are much misled, I recommend an important recent book called Human Smoke, The Beginnings of World War II, The End of Civilization. The book was published 10 years ago by Nicholson Baker about World War II. It questions the commonly held belief that the Allies, the US and the UK, wanted to avoid the war with Germany in 1941, but were forced into action by Adolf Hitler's aggression. It consists largely of official government transcripts, newspaper articles, and other documents from the time, with Baker only occasionally interjecting commentary. Baker cites documents to suggest the leaders of the US and the UK were provoking Germany and Japan into war and had ulterior motives for participating. Basically, they thought they could win. He dedicates the book to American and British pacifists of the time, who he states in the book's epilogue, were right all along. Quote, they failed, but they were right. So the history of fascism is not exactly what we take it to be in this country, and part of the vast propaganda system that we discuss politics in the midst of. I want to turn now to some notes on these matters compiled by our chief researcher, J.B. Nicholson. And he starts with a reference to the British Imperial War Museum. The War Museum has funded a film that is around now, and to my surprise, there are a number of interesting political films traveling under the radar at the moment that are worth paying attention to. The British Imperial War Museum was founded after the First World War. I was last there 20 years ago when my daughter and I we planned to spend an hour, and we spent the day until they closed, at this remarkable collection of documents and artifacts, primarily from the First World War, that presented the picture of Winston Churchill, for example, that I just went through. Something's happened to the British War Museum since I was there 20 years ago. It's been redone, remodeled, updated, and re-propagandized. This was during the Tony Blair government in Britain, not surprisingly. It was quite a critical account of the British First World War. I remember the most interesting thing that I read there that day we spent were letters from British children who had been sent to Canada at the outbreak of the war for their safety. They told more about what Britain was like in the fall of 1939 and in the first years of the war than anything else I had seen. They're apparently gone now. And the museum has been turned into a celebration of the sort of imperialism that Churchill stood for. One of the things they've done is fund Peter Jackson's latest film, a World War I film called, quote, They Shall Not Grow Old, close quote. Chris Hedges, the remarkable essayist, has a disapproving review of Peter Jackson's film. Jackson, by the way, was the director of the Tolkien films, The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings and so forth, but he's made what is essentially a propaganda film about the First World War. Hedges writes, when director-producer Peter Jackson's World War I film, They Shall Not Grow Old, which miraculously transforms grainy, choppy, black and white archival footage from the war into a modern 3D color extravaganza, begins, he bombards us with the cliches used to ennoble war. Veterans over background music say things like, "I wouldn't have missed it. I would go through it all over again because I enjoyed the service life, and it made me a man." It must have taken some effort after the war to find a tiny minority of veterans willing to utter this rubbish. Military life is a form of servitude. Prolonged exposure to combat leaves you broken, scarred for life by trauma, and often so numb you have difficulty connecting with others. And the last thing war does is make you a man. Far more common was the experience of the actor Wilfrid Lawson, who was wounded in the war and as a result had a metal plate in his skull. He drank heavily to dull the incessant pain. In his memoirs, Inside Memory, Timothy Findlay, who acted with him, recalled that Lawson, quote, always went to bed sodden and all night drunk, and all night long he would be dragged from one nightmare to another, often yelling, more often screaming, very often struggling physically to free himself of impeding bedclothes, and threatening shapes in the shadows, close quote. He would pound the wall shouting, "Help, help, help." David Lloyd George, wartime Prime Minister of Britain, in his memoirs used language like this to describe the conflict, quote, "Inexhaustible vanity that will never admit a mistake, individuals who would rather the million perish than that they as leaders should own even to themselves that they were blunderers, the notoriety attained by a narrow and stubborn egotism, unsurpassed among the records of disaster wrought by human complacency, a bad scheme badly handled, impossible orders issued by generals who had no idea what the execution of their commands really meant, this insane enterprise, this muddy and muddle-headed venture," close quote. Some of the best accounts of this came out from the poets of the First World War. The poets often get there first, as we occasionally observe on this program. The British Imperial War Museum, which was behind the Jackson film, had no interest in portraying the dark reality of war. War may be savage, brutal, and hard, but is also, according to the myth, ennobling, heroic, and selfless. You can believe this drivel only if you have never been in combat, which is what allows Jackson to modernize a cartoon version of this war. By the way, we have a local example right now where the local daily, the News Gazette, has been running extracts of the memoirs of veterans, mostly from Vietnam, some from Iraq and elsewhere, that are all in this sort of uplifting mode. It's a lie. Now, from the ridiculous to perhaps something more sublime, I'm not sure. NBC recently fired 40-year NBC sports host Bob Costas after Costas participates in a talk about the concussion danger of American football and spells it out plainly: American football causes concussions. This is not unconnected with the previous story. I played football in high school, loved it, followed football for many years after that, until, and remember all those years, including years in which they'd have flyovers by jets over college football stadiums and whatnot. It was connected with the military. Football made you a man, the military made you a man. This was the rehearsal for combat. The issue that is most substantial, the existential issue in the nature of football itself, the reality is that this game destroys people's brains. That's Bob Costas. NBC contract with the NFL is said to be worth $9 billion. That's what one network gets from running professional football. NBC Sports released a statement: Bob Costas' opinions are his own, and they do not represent those of the NBC Sports Group. NBC has a history of doing this kind of thing. This is reminiscent of Phil Donahue and Jesse Ventura, each being fired from their separate MSNBC shows, both for speaking against the 2003 invasion of Iraq. At the time of Donahue's firing, an internal NBC memo said Donahue had to be fired because he would be, quote, a difficult public face for NBC in a time of war, close quote, i.e. he was talking against the war. Ventura's show, Jesse Ventura's America, was canceled, and Ventura was paid for keeping silent about the entire affair for a while. The LA Times interviewed him. This is not your first venture into TV hosting since leaving the governorship. What happened to Jesse Ventura's America, which ran briefly on MSNBC in 2003? Ventura answered, it was awful. I was basically silenced. When I came out of office, he meant the governorship, I was the hottest commodity out there. There was a bidding war between CNN, Fox, and MSNBC to get my services. MSNBC ultimately won. I was being groomed for a 5-day-a-week TV show by them. Then all of a sudden, weird phone calls started happening. Quote, is it true Jesse doesn't support the war in Iraq? Close quote. My contract said I couldn't do any other cable TV or any news shows, and they honored and paid it for the duration of it. So in essence, I had my silence purchased. Why do you think you didn't hear from me for 3 years? I was under contract. They wouldn't even use me as a consultant. When you live in Mexico, your houses all have names. I almost named my house Casa MSNBC because they bought it. I was paid like a professional athlete, and I got very wealthy for doing nothing. That's Jesse Ventura. Currently, Ventura has a show on RT, The World According to Jesse. But of course, you're not encouraged to watch that in America. NBC also fired Ed Schultz for covering the Bernie Sanders campaign during the 2016 U.S. presidential race. Schultz's last TV show was on RT before his death in 2018. Representative Tulsi Gabbard, Democrat from Hawaii, is getting some bad press and being purposely left out of coverage of Democratic Party presidential candidates. Our researcher, J.B. Nicholson, writes, I think something else is going on, and I think the so-called progressives are playing right into it. He wants to suggest that Gabbard is not exactly what she seems, or that it isn't clear what it is she seems to be. We'll be talking about this on a future program, talking about Gabbard and the peculiar presidential campaign she's running. There's a good piece in the Counterpunch website today by Richard Falk, a longtime political commentator and indeed anti-war activist in this country. I recommend that as a background to the piece that our researcher will place on the that I'll place on the website, or rather the Facebook page, for Aware on the Air. You are watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort, a local Champaign-Urbana peace group. I'm Carl Estabrook. We're recording this at midday on Tuesday, February 19th, in the studios of Urbana Public Television. Our subject is the wars the U.S. government is waging around the world, and the racism we display to those we're killing, in accord with the Latin proverb, proprium humanae ingeni est, odisse cum laceris. It's human nature to hate those you have injured. While we're preoccupied with politics at home, our government is killing people around the world. International polls show that it's the United States that is by far the most feared government in the world, not Russia, China, Iran, or Israel. The wars the U.S. is waging in 8 countries, and its war provocations against Russia and China, risk a wider, even nuclear war. Although most Americans are not aware of it, the U.S. government is today making war, killing people in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen. They're doing so principally to control the flow of oil out of the Mideast and North Africa, which the U.S. uses as a weapon against its economic rivals from Germany to China. The ongoing drone assassination program, called the most extreme terrorist campaign of modern times, has killed thousands of people, most of them not the presumed targets, including American citizens and hundreds of children. The program has been exercised by all recent American presidents, notably Barack Obama and Donald Trump. More than 250,000 of American troops are stationed in 1,000 U.S. military bases on foreign soil, most of them surrounding Russia and China. No other country has more than a dozen foreign military bases. China has one. The 70,000 members of the U.S. Special Operations Command are active in 3/4 of the countries of the world. Their activities have included kidnapping, the U.S. government calls it rendition, and torture. Since 1945, the United States has killed between 20 and 30 million people in wars in Korea, Vietnam, the Mideast, and elsewhere, designed to maintain the worldwide economic dominance that the U.S. inherited at the end of World War II. It is unfortunately the basis of U.S. foreign policy to use war and the threats of war to retard the economic development of Russia and China as competitors to American control of the world economy. From U.S. support for a fascist coup in Ukraine, to U.S. naval provocations in the South China Sea, and huge NATO military exercises in Eastern Europe. The rest of the world recognizes that the U.S. government is what Martin Luther King called it long ago, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. With other peace groups around the world, AWARE calls upon President Trump and our government to close all foreign military bases, bring all U.S. troops and weapons home, and provide social supports, including free medical care, education, and a universal basic income for Americans who've been made poorer by generations of our government's wars. Today's an anniversary. On this day, 77 years ago, President Franklin Roosevelt ordered the detention of all Japanese Americans. They were to be put in camps, and that's indeed what happened. Some of the history, some of the story that gets lost in the American propaganda system turns up in the strangest places, including occasionally film and theater. Another example of the poets often getting there first. I recommend, for example, the current film Vice, which is a pun, written and directed by Adam McKay. The film stars Christian Bale as former U.S. Vice President Dick Cheney, with very good actors, including Amy Adams and Steve Carell in support. The film follows Cheney on his path to become the most powerful vice president in American history, Vice President to George Bush II, and to conduct the vicious ongoing wars the U.S. military is waging around the world. Hollywood was afraid of this movie and marketed it as a comedy drama. Well, if you think killing a lot of people is comedy, that's fine. The movie is a smart movie, an intelligent movie that, with remarkable performances by a number of actors, including Bale, and notably including Bale, and it gives a fairly accurate account of the vast war crimes committed by previous administrations, notably the Cheney-Bush administration. Also, on my recent hiatus, I was in New York for a while seeing a little theater. One of the most interesting pieces called The Ferryman. Ferryman is a reference to Charon, the Greek boatman who took people to the underworld, dead people. The Ferryman is a 2017 play by Jez Butterworth set during the Troubles, the wars in Northern Ireland that came to an end with the Good Friday Agreement. It tells the story of a family of a former IRA, Irish Republican Army, activists living in their farmhouse in rural County Armagh in Northern Ireland in 1981. It's a remarkable play, good script and excellent actors, a brilliant production, directed by Sam Mendes. I recommend it highly if you have a chance to see it or read it, or perhaps one day it will turn up as a presentation in the local theaters. The subject is war and politics, the subjects that are carefully conditioned for the American mind by our media. You're watching Aware on the Air. We have a couple of other matters to turn to. The theme today is the effects of the wars that the United States is carrying on, even though most Americans don't know about them. After a speech in Miami by President Trump yesterday, the U.S. National Security Advisor, John Bolton, tweeted the following, quote, "Today, President Trump presented Venezuela's military officers with a choice. Work for a democratic future for all Venezuelans, or see the financial circle close for their families and loved ones," close quote. If you know anything about John Bolton, you just know he typed noose first instead of circle. He was threatening them. That would be the same John Bolton, for the record, who once threatened to murder an international official's children for obstructing his attempts to manufacture support for the Iraq invasion, which killed 1 million human beings and plunged the region into terrorism and chaos. A man named Jose Bustani was the Director General of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons in early 2002, during which time it was reported that he came under fire for having too much success in diplomacy with the Iraqi government, which undermined the case for the U.S. invasion of Iraq. Remember, the case was set out, they had weapons of mass destruction, including chemical weapons, and therefore they had to be killed by the U.S. Bolton attempted to scare off this man who was having a good effect in getting the Iraqis to give up even their chemical weapons. Cheney wants you out. Cheney, Vice President Cheney, whom we've been mentioning. Bustani recalled Bolton saying, referring to the then Vice President of the United States, quote, "We can't accept your management style." Bolton continued, according to Bustani's recollections, Bustani was the man who was getting rid of the chemical weapons, quote, "You have 24 hours to leave the organization, and if you don't comply with this decision by Washington, we have ways to retaliate against you." There was a pause. "We know where your kids live. You have 2 sons in New York." Close quote. And now we see the same psychopath, John Bolton, threatening to starve and impoverish the families of a sovereign nation's military if they don't facilitate a coup by the most violent government on earth and the most oil-rich nation on the planet, all in the name of spreading freedom and democracy, trademark, of course. Bolton, who was in attendance at the president's speech, gave a more direct and honest summary of what was happening than the one Trump's speechwriters fed him. Quote, "We seek a peaceful transition of power, but all options are open," Trump said of the U.S.-led Venezuela coup agenda. "We want to restore Venezuelan democracy, and we believe that the Venezuelan military and its leadership have a vital role to play in this process. If you choose this path, you have an opportunity to help forge a safe and prosperous future for all of the people of Venezuela. Or you can choose the second path, continuing to support Maduro, the elected president of Venezuela. If you choose this path, you will find no safe harbor, no easy exit, and no way out. You will lose everything," close quote. That would be the same President Trump, for the record, who just hours earlier tweeted about, quote, an illegal coup attempt on the President of the United States, close quote, regarding statements made by former acting FBI Director Andrew McCabe that there had been discussions among top officials at the Justice Department and the FBI about possibly using the 25th Amendment to remove Trump from office. This same man who's outraged about an attempt to oust him early on in his administration using laws and bureaucracy has no qualms about ousting the government of a sovereign nation using starvation sanctions, CIA ops, an aggressive campaign to delegitimize Maduro, and now outright threats to the nation's military personnel. Trump has also been tweeting furiously about the lies McCabe told about him, who wrote the following in his new book about a 2017 Oval Office meeting. This is the FBI Assistant Director. Quote, "Then the president talked about Venezuela. That's the country we should be going to war with," he said. "They have all that oil, and they're right on our back door." He continued on, rambling and spitballing about whatever came to mind, close quote. That was this corrupt FBI director reporting probably accurately what Trump said. I'm sure that McCabe is as much of a deceitful sleaze as every other FBI boss, but that part at least sounds truthful. For the rest of Trump's speech, he very tediously introduced all his loyal sycophants backing his Venezuela's agendas. He bloviated repeatedly about the horrible, horrifying terror of socialism. He kept referring to Venezuela's elected leader as dictator Maduro, and some rando that fewer than 1 in 5 Venezuelans had even heard of until last month as President Guaido. He tossed out nonsensical red herrings about Venezuela being controlled by Cuba, and he repeated his administration's brain-dead talking point about the Venezuelan government refusing to let in U.S. humanitarian aid, which the Red Cross, the UN, and even war-happy NPR recognized as a transparent ploy to foment regime change. These are the people you're meant to believe are the good guys coming to the rescue, America. The guys who threaten to kill the families of officials if they aren't given their way. The guys who threaten to starve the families of military officials who don't turn on their government and kill anyone who tries to stop them. The guys who picked mass murder facilitator Elliot Abrams to spearhead Venezuela's transition to freedom and democracy, trademark. The guys who helped murder 1 million Iraqis and plunge us into a new area of military expansionism and Orwellian surveillance. Those guys. Sometimes it's hard to say what's more frustrating, the fact that these deadly imperialist regime change power grabs keep happening, or the fact that people keep buying the same old tired stories that are used to tell them. The following open letter, signed by 70 scholars on Latin America, political science, and history, as well as filmmakers, civil society leaders, and other experts, was issued last week in opposition to ongoing intervention by the United States in Venezuela. The letter, quote, "The United States government must cease interfering in Venezuela's internal politics, especially for the purpose of overthrowing the country's government. Actions by the Trump administrations and its allies in the hemisphere are most certain to make the situation in Venezuela worse, leading to unnecessary human suffering, violence, and instability. Venezuela's political polarization is not new. The country has long been divided along racial and socioeconomic lines, but the polarization has deepened in recent years. This is partly due to U.S. support for the opposition strategy aimed at removing the government of Nicolas Maduro through extra-electoral means. While the opposition has been divided on this strategy, U.S. support has backed hardline opposition sectors in their goal of ousting the Maduro government through often violent protests, a military coup d'etat, or other avenues that sidestep the ballot box. Under the Trump administration, aggressive rhetoric against the Venezuelan government has ratcheted up to a more extreme and threatening level, with Trump administration officials talking of military action, and condemning Venezuela, along with Cuba and Nicaragua, as part of a troika of tyranny. Problems resulting from Venezuelan government policy have been worsened by U.S. economic sanctions, illegal under the Organization of American States and the United Nations, as well as U.S. law and under other international treaties and conventions. These sanctions have cut off the means by which the Venezuelan government could escape from its economic recession, while causing a dramatic fall-off in oil production and worsening the economic crisis, and causing many people to die because they can't get access to life-saving medicines. Meanwhile, the U.S. and other governments continue to blame the Venezuelan government solely for the economic damage, even that caused by the U.S. sanctions. Now, the U.S. and its allies, including OAS Secretary General Luis Almagro and Brazil's far-right president, Jair Bolsonaro, have pushed Venezuela to the precipice. By recognizing National Assembly President Juan Guaido as the new president of Venezuela, something illegal under the OAS Charter, the Trump administration has sharply accelerated Venezuela's political crisis in the hopes of dividing the Venezuelan military and further polarizing the populace, forcing them to choose sides. The obvious and sometimes stated goal is to force Maduro out via a coup d'etat. The reality is that despite hyperinflation, shortages, and a deep depression, Venezuela remains a politically polarized country. The U.S. and its allies must cease encouraging violence by pushing for violent extra-legal regime change. If the Trump administration and its allies continue to pursue their reckless course in Venezuela, the most likely result will be bloodshed, chaos, and instability. The U.S. should have learned something from its regime change ventures in Iraq, Syria, Libya, and its long violent history of sponsoring regime change in Latin America. Neither side in Venezuela can simply vanquish the other. The military, for example, has at least 235,000 frontline members, and there are at least 1.6 million in militias. Many of these people will fight, not only on the basis of a belief in national sovereignty that is widely held in Latin America, in the face of what increasingly appears to be a U.S.-led intervention, but also to protect themselves from likely repression if the opposition topples the government by force. In such situations, the only solution is a negotiated settlement, as has happened in the past in Latin American countries when politically polarized societies were unable to resolve their differences through elections. There have been efforts, such as those led by the Vatican in the fall of 2016, that had potential, but they received no support from Washington and its allies who favored regime change. This strategy must change if there's to be any viable solution to the ongoing crisis in Venezuela. For the sake of the Venezuelan people, the region, and for the principle of national sovereignty, these international actors should instead support negotiations between the Venezuelan government and its opponents that will allow the country to finally emerge from its political and economic crisis. This is signed by 70 academic and political figures in the U.S., led by Noam Chomsky, Professor Emeritus at MIT and Laureate Professor at the University of Arizona. You have been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of AWARE, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, recorded in the studios of Urbana Public Television on February 19th in the 8th week of 2019. Another week in which everyone can see that the most extensive global terrorism is U.S. worldwide war-making, for which its principal criminal associates these days are the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Israel. The U.S. aids the Saudis in their near-genocidal war in Yemen, and the Israelis in their racist oppression of the Palestinian people. The Israeli government has murdered protesters at the fence with Gaza, the world's largest open-air prison camp. The U.S. supports that primarily because Israel is a U.S. stationary aircraft carrier for the control of U.S. control of Mideast energy, gas, and oil, a weapon against U.S. economic rivals from Germany to China. Such outrages cannot be dismissed as something that happens only in the global South. The Illinois legislature voted to use University of Illinois funds to support Israeli apartheid, something that our local representative, Carol Ammons, would never have done for South African apartheid. There's a message from our colleague in Aware, Stuart Levy, looking at some other Illinois State House bills, turned up a resolution, in fact sponsored by that same Carol Ammons and Linda Chapa-Lavia, H.R. 61, Nuclear Weapons and No First Use is the title. It resolves A, to call on the U.S. President to make it U.S. policy of no first use of nuclear weapons. The U.S. doesn't have such a policy now. And B, for Congress to pass legislation to that effect. And C, for the Congress to stop funding new nuclear weapons, quote, that can produce a relatively small nuclear explosion, potentially lowering the threshold to using nuclear weapons first, close quote. That was initiated by a vast and expensive 10-year program by the last president of the United States, Barack Obama. If you like this idea, that is the idea of the Illinois legislature passing a resolution on these matters, you can support it short of going to Springfield by filing a witness slip in support of the bill. Instructions for doing that, as this bill, H.R. 61, moves through the Illinois legislature, instructions for making a representation to the Illinois legislature can be found on the Facebook page for Aware. On this show, Aware on the Air, we concentrate on the shamefully underreported news of U.S. war-making and U.S. plans for more war-making, such as the Obama administration's plan to build usable nuclear weapons. This week, there will be a panel discussion on campus about the shamefully unreported U.S. support for war in Africa. Aware member Karen Arams writes, "Come join us for a panel on the stealth escalation of U.S. military presence in Africa, February 21st at 7 p.m. in Lincoln Hall, room 1092. That, too, will be on the Facebook page for Aware on the Air. The panel will feature UIUC faculty members Lou Turner and Ken Salo, student activist Karen Oluwu, and PhD candidate Vukone Lupa-Lasaga. The panelists will discuss decolonization and national liberation struggles, the impact of U.S. military interventionism in African countries, and strategies for fighting back against American imperialism across the African continent. It's sponsored by a local chapter of the Party for Socialism and Liberation. We here at Aware are announcing the program that they've established. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Crofton Coleman, thanks to whom this program and others like it will be available on YouTube and archive.org. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Assange, Manning, Snowden, and others, who are truth-tellers persecuted by the U.S. government, and particularly, by the way, our liberal Democrat Senator Durbin, a shill for the Russiagate propaganda and the attacks on WikiLeaks. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for the members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, saying in the words of the late broadcaster Edward R. Murrow, good night and good luck.